Welcome back to the Dirt Show. We're seeing a lot of muscle flexing going on. Judge Boasberg will talk about him threatening to hold the Trump administration in contempt. Harvard flexing its muscles. Trump fighting back and saying we're going to take away Harvard's tax deduction or tax exemption. We live in an age where we see a lot of pandering and muscle flexing openly, but behind the scenes, I think we're seeing negotiations and attempts to try to find compromises. I'll be following this very carefully, particularly the Harvard story, because I'm so qualified to focus on the Harvard story, having been a faculty member at Harvard for 60 years. I think I probably am one of the longest standing faculty members in Harvard's history. I started when I was, 25 years old. I think I became an assistant professor at Harvard and then a full professor at 28. I know I was the youngest professor in Harvard's history. I was also told by a librarian that I have written more words, not necessarily better words, but more words than any Harvard professor in history. This is my 56th book. It's called The Preventive State, The Challenge of Preventing Serious Harms While Preserving Essential Liberties, with an introduction by Justice Stephen Breyer. It's coming out soon. You can buy it in advance on Amazon.com. But, I wrote millions of words at Harvard, some better than others. And I taught thousands of students, 10,000 students. I used to teach classes with 1,000 students. When I taught my class on thinking about thinking, it was in the largest lecture hall, and people were sitting in the aisles and standing outside and listening over a microphone. And so I know Harvard pretty well. And I know the president of Harvard, and I know the president of the United States. So I think I'm in a pretty good position to assess what's going on. Again, I made the prediction yesterday, I'll make it again. This case will be settled. In the end, Harvard will not lose its tax exemption, and it will have some funding cut off, but the funding that's designed to have medical research will not be cut off. But I think Harvard will make some changes. It already did. It's already settled two lawsuits from organizations that were alleging that they were in violation of federal civil rights law. So without acknowledging it openly, they've implicitly acknowledged that they can do a lot better, and I think they will do a lot better. And my hope, as somebody who both represented President Trump and who was associated with Harvard for 60 years, is that this can be resolved. Now, thank God nobody's asked me to come in and try to resolve it. That's not a role I would like to play. I'm much more of an advocate than I am a conciliator or a negotiator or an arbitrator. But I do think that this conflict will be resolved. I also think the conflict that we're going to talk about today between executive action involving deportation and the due process rights of potential deportees, I think that too will be resolved by the Supreme Court. It will be resolved not through actions like Judge Boasberg saying, I threaten you with contempt, I'm going to put you in jail. That's not going to work. It's not going to have any impact. It's not going to be upheld. I suspect that what we're going to see is a much more nuanced decisions by the United States Supreme Court, in which the justices hold maybe 6-3, maybe 9-0, maybe 5-4. I can't predict the numbers, but I can predict, I think, the outcome. They're going to say, Mr. President, you do have the executive authority to decide who stays and who doesn't stay. If you're not a citizen of the United States, you're a guest. And if you're a guest, the rules are flexible as to what you can do, what you can say, what you can advocate. If you come to this country on a student visa and you start blocking classes for other people and don't let people study and wear masks and harass people, no, you're not welcome. But what the Supreme Court's going to say is if the president has that authority, and he does, it has to be administered properly, consistently with due process. But due process is a variable concept. It's the process that is due you based on your status. If you're a citizen, you get enormous due process. If you're a student visa, you get very little due process. If you're a green card holder, it's somewhere in the middle. So I think we're going to see a series of decisions over the next months and perhaps even next years that will rationalize how immigration law works in this country. Right now, it's the Wild West. And as I've said before, if I were a young recent graduate of a law school, and I wanted to think of a career for the next 4 years, the area I'd go into would be immigration and deportation law. It's where the action is going to be for the next few years, because, again, I predict that President Trump will push very hard. He believes that he was elected to make executive decisions and sign executive actions, and he's probably signed more and more diverse executive actions than any president in the short period of time that he's been in the Oval Office. Now, of course, President Jefferson did a lot of that too, and so did President Lincoln. And most importantly, and most recently, in the last century, it was President Roosevelt who, one after the other, signed decrees and actions and changed the nature of the federal bureaucracy. Some of it he did with congressional help. Some of it he did without congressional help. And so we're going to see a direct conflict between the executive branch and the judicial branch. And so far, the legislative branch has been silent. And the interesting thing is the legislative branch can really help avoid a lot of these conflicts, because if it passed laws, not executive actions, laws, the Supreme Court would give more deference and more credence to legislatively enacted laws than to presidentially signed statements. So right now, we've seen Congress mostly asleep and mostly playing a negative role. Obviously, it has to pass the budget. It has to pass a number of other essential legislative actions. But in a lot of these areas, like immigration and deportation, it hasn't done very much. And we're going to see there's probably going to be a real opportunity for the president and for Congress when it comes to a deal with Iran. If there is to be a deal with Iran, we don't know. We'll know better this weekend because they're meeting again. But if there's going to be a deal with Iran, we'll see whether or not this president does what I think Barack Obama erroneously did, and that is he created a deal with Iran based on an executive action, which meant that President Trump could immediately abolish it as soon as he came into office, because what can be done by executive action can be undone by executive action, by the way. One court has said no to that. One court has said what Biden did through executive action, allowing lots of people to stay in the country, can't be undone by executive action. That's just wrong. The courts will uphold the right and the power of the president to undo a previous president's executive actions. It might say that they have to give fair warning and they have to give time to adjust and all that. But on the merits, if a decision, an important decision, is made through executive action of one president, it can be unmade through executive action by another president. That brings us, of course, to the most recent decision by Judge Boasberg, where he's flexed his judicial muscle. He's 6'6", I think. He's a tough guy, former basketball player, I think at Yale College or somewhere like that. And he's basically threatened to hold the Trump administration in contempt. Does that mean holding the president in contempt? Does that mean criminal contempt or civil contempt? We don't know. He's threatened essentially criminal contempt. What he said is, look, I said you got to turn those planes back, and you didn't turn those planes back. Some of them were in the air, sure, but you could turn them back. And the others, one of them at least was on the ground, and you shouldn't have let it take off. And the administration comes back and says, well, wait a minute, you said that orally, but then you wrote an opinion. And in the opinion, you didn't say they had to be brought back. And we were taught in law school that when a judge renders two decisions, one orally and the other in writing, the subsequent written opinion governs, not the earlier oral opinion. The earlier opinion seemed preliminary, kind of like a preliminary injunction. But the written opinion came later, and it didn't include an order to turn back. And now it's important because of this. even assuming that Boasberg was wrong, dead wrong, completely wrong, had no power, no jurisdiction, even assuming he shouldn't have decided the case because his daughter apparently works for an anti-deportation group and makes a living defending people who are being deported. But assuming all that, assuming he was wrong to decide. If a judge gives an order, even if it's wrong, if somebody disobeys that order, the law is the person could be held in contempt. That is, you're not allowed to disobey an unlawful judicial order. Who made that up? The judges made that up, of course. And the judges have said, even if our order is unlawful, if we say it, you have to abide by it. Again, reminds me of the joke of the angel Gabriel being called to examine God. And he says, we have to have Sigmund Freud come in here to examine God. God has a paranoid mental illness. He thinks he's a federal judge. Federal judges think they are above the law and above morality. They think that because they're wearing robes, not all of them, I know a lot of them, and most of them are very decent people. But boy, I've been before judges that are so peremptory and so outrageous in their conduct. And I stand up to these judges. I have stood up to them for years, and I've been threatened with contempt, never held in contempt, but threatened with contempt by a judge. I was sanctioned by a judge once, and that was reversed unanimously by the appellate court. But I'm a tough lawyer, so I do confront judges. But people are terrified of judges. I'll never forget a time I was in the courtroom arguing a case, and my father, who was then in his 70s and suffering from Alzheimer's, and was an Orthodox Jew, and he came into the court, and he wanted to watch me, and he wore his hat, his little cap, which he always wore, because under Orthodox Jewish law, you have to wear your head covered. And Judge Arnold Bauman starts screaming at my father and saying, "Take your hat off, you showing disrespect for the court. I'll hold you in contempt. Take your hat off." My father was so scared. I came up in front of the bench and said, "Your Honor, you can't talk to somebody like that. He's a citizen of the United States. He's an Orthodox Jew. He wears a hat everywhere. If you want to tell him that he can't come into the courtroom wearing a hat, call him into the side room, talk to him." And I said, "By the way, he's my father." And Judge Bauman backed away immediately and said, "Oh my God, he's your father. If I knew it was your father, I wouldn't have treated him that way." I said, "Your Honor, you shouldn't treat anybody that way. That's not the way judges treat citizens of the United States. This is their courtroom as much as it's your courtroom." I can tell you, I had a contentious relationship with Judge Bauman, but I won most of my cases, either in front of him or on appeal, and we had a kind of love-hate relationship over the years, and ultimately he gave me the highest compliment. He asked me to pick his law clerks for him because he said he likes law clerks that are feisty, and he wanted law clerks that I would pick. So, sometimes being tough pays off. Look, we're going to see this conflict between the judicial branch and the executive branch carry forward for the next several years. So I'm going to make some predictions again. Judge Boasberg will not hold the Trump administration in contempt, and the Trump administration is not going to back away. It will assert the government secrecy. It will assert the government privilege. Ultimately, he will back away, or he will issue some order that's short of contempt, and that will be appealable. And the appellate courts will not give him the power to hold the President of the United States or the administration in contempt. I think that contempt is an extraordinary remedy, and it should only be used when all other remedies have been exhausted. And what you can do is issue an order, stay the order, and allow the appellant to appeal the order. That's the way it's generally done. Threatening contempt doesn't show strength. It shows weakness. And so I think we're going to see these cases appealed. We're going to see them appealed vigorously by the current administration. They're not backing away. I know the Attorney General of the United States quite well, and I know the number 2 and number 3 person in the Justice Department. They're not going to be cowed by judges threatening them with contempt. Even if they're held in contempt, they're not going to be imprisoned. Nobody is going to. And by the way, the judge already announced, he said, I will hold these people in contempt. And if the Justice Department refuses to prosecute them for contempt, I will appoint a lawyer to be a special prosecutor to prosecute these people. That won't stand either. No, under their system of separation of powers, it's the United States government that decides who to prosecute, not the judiciary. The judiciary doesn't have the power to prosecute. It may have the power to hold somebody in contempt. In the old days, the judge could actually put the person in a cell in the courthouse. And I've actually been in a cell in a courthouse. There are cells in the courthouse. But a judge can't make the United States government prosecute a case, and I don't think a judge can appoint a special prosecutor. There are cases on that. During the period of segregation in the South, there's a case involving Katzenbach, who was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States to Robert Kennedy, and he arranged to have a judge have a special counsel appointed to prosecute somebody because in the South, the state or the feds wouldn't appoint. I don't think that's good law. I do not think in the end that we're going to see a judge decide who to prosecute. That would violate completely our system of checks and balances and separation of powers. The prosecutorial decision lies exclusively with the executive, the judicial decision lies with the judiciary, and legislative decisions lie with the legislature. For example, when the legislature holds somebody in contempt, what do? They have to go to the Justice Department. The Justice Department has to decide to prosecute. Again, in Congress, there's a cell, there's an actual jail cell, and theoretically, Congress could vote to put somebody directly in a jail cell if they're in contempt of Congress, the same way a judge could probably order the marshal to put somebody in the judicial jail cell. But what I think they cannot do is either compel the executive branch to prosecute anybody or appoint lawyers to use the prosecutorial system. But that's interesting, whether or not the judge will actually do that, or whether or not Boasberg is bluffing, or whether or not he thinks he has more power than he has. We don't know the answer to those questions. What we're seeing, again, I want to emphasize this, we are not seeing a constitutional crisis. We are seeing a constitutional conflict. We have seen constitutional conflicts from the time of Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The constitutional crisis, and it was a short one, was with Andrew Jackson when he refused to enforce the order of the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court. And nothing came of it, particularly. The losers were Native Americans who didn't have much status or rights back in those days. But that's as close as we ever came to having a constitutional crisis in our history. Of course, we had a constitutional crisis between 1860 and 1865. It was called the Civil War. We had to fight a war in order to enforce the law. And of course, that was caused by a Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision really supported the southern side of the crisis rather than the northern side of the crisis. But it culminated in a war that many historians think could have been avoided had the North simply allowed the South to secede. People forget that the South, particularly South Carolina, issued a Declaration of Independence based on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, declaring South Carolina to be a sovereign and independent state when in the course of human events it becomes necessary. So they declared that, and that could have happened. That could have been the result. A separate state of South Carolina, Virginia, some other states joined them, some other states didn't. But then you had that naval and military conflict at Fort Sumter that resulted in shots being fired at Fort Sumter. Nobody was injured. They could easily have just backed away and said, whoops, sorry, we've had one little skirmish, but we're not going to have a war. But instead, they decided to have the bloodiest war in all of American history. More people were killed in the Civil War than in any other war in history. But it ended up ending slavery. It ended up with the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and it ended up with the Southern states becoming part of and remaining part of the United States. So that's been our only real constitutional crisis. I predict we're not going to have another. We're not going to have a civil war. We have civil disagreement, sometimes not so civil. We are a deeply, deeply, deeply divided nation, and that division is reflected today by neither side backing down. And in the end, I think we will see a resolution of these issues. We'll see compromises about some of them. We'll see judicial decisions that will make neither side completely happy. I think we'll see the Harvard dispute resolved by that kind of an ending. And what's going to happen is, if there is a resolution to the Harvard matter, the faculty, which consists largely of hard left ideologues, will be very unhappy. Maybe the president will be fired. Who knows? But there will be a deal in the end. People have to remember that universities are not just the current faculty. Universities consist of alumni, contributors, students, future students, past students, etc. And so we're going to see conflict. We live in an age of conflict, and more conflict than we've seen through most of my long career. And as somebody who's been involved in conflict, I grew up during McCarthyism. Boy, was that a conflict. And then I came of age during the Vietnam period. Boy, was that conflict. I defended protesters, and even some violent protesters. The Chicago 7, Dr. Spock. We saw that. And we're going to see more of that. We will not live through 4 easy, peaceful years during the Trump administration. And the reason for that is we're going to see Trump push the envelope very hard, and we're going to see the judiciary push back very hard. A lot will depend on what happens in the midterm elections. If the midterm elections maintain Republican control over both houses, then the conflict will be starker between the executive and the judiciary. If, on the other hand, Democrats maintain control of one house of the legislature, we will see the legislature perhaps play a greater role in that conflict itself. But don't expect peaceful times. And then there's the role of the media. Today, nobody trusts the media. I flip the channels. I hear one account, I hear another account. I can't figure out what the truth is. I have to flip from channel to channel. And in the end, you have to make up your own mind, your own decision. That's why I love when people listen to my show, because they hear, I think, my perspective on this. I try to present both sides fairly, and you get to decide. You get to write me letters. So let me read you some of the letters you wrote to me. Okay. Your comparison of pro-Hamas and KKK is spot on. I extend it to not only KKK, but to the Nazis in the 1930s, not the 1940s, but the 1930s in Berlin and in Munich and other such places. So, if you're pro-Hamas, you're pro-Nazi, you're pro-Ku Klux Klan, you are an evil and terrible person if you support Hamas. The image of Hamas is raping, beheading, burning to death, murdering people. And if you're on Hamas's side, you're on the side of evil and horror. And so I'm always upset to see young students with Hamas flags. If we want to wear a symbol, wear this symbol, the symbol which calls for the freeing of the hostages. I hope maybe by next week when we're on, we will see some hostages released. There's a plan in the works of perhaps 9 or 10 hostages being released in exchange for thousands of murderers being released from Hamas. Okay. Hooray, Professor Dershowitz. You are correct. Prejudice against Jews is the same as the KKK against blacks. I so love and respect you, sir. Your statements calling people on their hypocrisy and racism. You have a good moral sense. I am like you. Right is right. Wrong is wrong. I would defend my worst enemy if he was in the right and being wronged. Okay, you're on my side. The problem with researchers getting money most universities keep 50% of the grants the researchers receive. So no, Harvard should not get research. That overstates it. Harvard gets a percentage. Sometimes it's 18%, sometimes it's 22%. I don't think it's as much as 50, but maybe sometimes it is. And the university then can decide how to spend that money, and it can use it for Middle East studies departments and anti-American, anti-Western studies departments. So I'm in favor of targeted research grants where the money goes directly to the researchers with only a small amount of money overhead for the university. Some of the stuff that they are asking of Harvard is pretty blatantly unconstitutional. This is the letter. It's a private school, so while they can enforce equal opportunity, they can't control the speech of the school, so demanding diversity of opinion is not valid. Well, okay, but you can then say we're not going to fund non-diverse institutions. If you were in the South and you were teaching white supremacy, you may have a right to do that, but the federal government is not going to pay you to teach white supremacy or to teach anti-Christian or anti-Jewish or anti-conservative values. That would be the same as demanding BYU, Brigham Young, a Mormon school, to teach classes about the benefits of coffee. You have to teach about the benefits of coffee, but some religious schools don't accept funding because they don't want the government in their pockets and they don't want the government in their classrooms. You have that option. But if you're taking money from the government, you can't violate federal law. And federal law doesn't deal with the virtues of coffee, but it does deal with the vice of anti-Semitism. And again, all I'm calling for is one thing: a single standard. A single standard. If you could say it about Jews, can you say it about blacks and women? If you can't say it about blacks, you can't say it about Jews. If you can't say it about transgenders and you can't say it about gays, you can't say it about Jews. We have to have a single standard. That's the test of anti-Semitism. If you violate the test of a single standard and you apply a harsher standard to Jewish people, to the nation state of the Jewish people, that's anti-Semitism. Okay. This is a letter that deals with that. You are quick to characterize views you don't like as anti-Semitism. No. But where do you draw the line? For example, assaulting or harassing a student on campus because they are Jewish is obviously anti-Semitic. What about a group of students gathering on campus shouting, "Free Palestine, stop Israel genocide"? No, I don't think that's necessarily anti-Semitic, as long as you can also get up on the campus and say in South Africa and bring back segregation and castrate gay men. As long as you can say all those things, you can say what you want, but you cannot have a double standard. You can't have rules that apply only to permitting hate speech against Jews and not permitting it against others. As long as you have a single standard, I'm with you. Final letter. I'm with you on targeted funding. Fine. We'll talk about that more some show in the future, but I wish you all a good week. I hope the news is better next week, and see you in a few days.